I'm Michael, 28, and I've spent most of my life quietly watching my family from the sidelines, trying to keep the peace while they bulldozed over my feelings like I was some kind of afterthought. Our family BBQs have always been a minefield disguised as casual summer fun, and this one started no differently. At least, that's what I thought at first. My parents had decided this year to host it at their house, which meant the same cramped backyard, the same wobbly lawn chairs, the same haphazard grill that Dad swore just needed a little love every year. I arrived early, hoping to help set things up, but even before I could unload the cooler from my car, my younger brother, Alex, made sure to remind me that my place in the family pecking order hadn't changed. "This spot's reserved for my friends only," he snorted, pointing at a rickety lawn chair next to the grill. He had that smirk that always made me feel like I was a character in someone else's story. Everyone laughed, Mom, Dad, even a few cousins who were clearly used to his antics. I had learned long ago that arguing with him was pointless. He thrived on attention, and the louder I protested, the more amused everyone else seemed to get. So I just smiled, nodded, and quietly picked another chair a few feet away, careful not to draw too much attention. Inside, though, I felt a familiar tight knot in my chest, that mix of frustration and helplessness I'd learned to ignore. The smell of charcoal, sizzling burgers, and sweet corn filled the backyard, and for a few minutes, I tried to lose myself in the small comforts of summer. The sunlight bouncing off the leaves, the faint hum of the neighbors' sprinklers, the soft laughter of the younger cousins chasing each other around the yard. But Alex had planted a seed, and it was growing fast. Every time I tried to enjoy a conversation or help with something, he found a way to insert himself in the center, always louder, always funnier, always the one everyone watched. It wasn't even subtle anymore. At 28, I thought I might have grown out of caring what he thought, but sitting there, feeling invisible in the chaos of my own family, I realized how deep the resentment ran. I started thinking back to other moments like this. My birthday dinners, holidays, family vacations, they all had a recurring theme. Alex getting the spotlight, while I silently endured the sidelines. My parents meant well, I suppose, but they never seemed to notice the little ways he shoved me out of the picture, and over the years, I'd learned to just tuck my feelings away, smile, and pretend it didn't hurt. This time, however, there was something different. Maybe it was the way Alex's friends had come along this year, smirking with him, whispering as they pointed at me. Maybe it was just me, tired of swallowing every indignity for the sake of keeping the peace. Whatever it was, a spark had ignited, quiet at first, but insistent. Lunch was served on the picnic table, a haphazard spread of burgers, hot dogs, potato salad, and those little grilled corn cobs that Dad insisted we all love even though they were usually charred to the point of blackness. Alex, of course, claimed the seat with the best view, strategically placed between Mom and Dad, ensuring he could monopolize the conversation. I stayed where I was, unmoving, silently observing. He regaled the table with a story about a project he'd led at work, exaggerating every detail. And of course, every laugh that followed was at my expense, or so it felt. Cousins chimed in with their own echoes of admiration for Alex, and I sat there, clenching my jaw, trying not to let my frustration show. I wanted to speak up, to tell everyone I was done being the background character in my own life, but the words caught in my throat. When dessert came out, homemade brownies and that ridiculous store-bought ice cream Mom insisted was the best, Alex had another brilliant idea. "Hey, I saved this chair for my friends, remember?" he said again, glancing at me as if I was expected to respond with laughter or shame. The table chuckled. I just sipped my lemonade, keeping my face neutral. Inside, I was calculating, thinking about the years of silent indignities, the quiet sacrifices I'd made, the constant reminder that in the eyes of my family, I wasn't worth the center of attention. That feeling, that simmering, tight, unfair weight, was familiar, but this time, it wasn't going to be quiet. The tension didn't explode right away. It was more of a slow burn, the kind that eats at you when you least expect it. After the food was cleared and the backyard started to feel sticky with the summer heat, Dad decided it was time for drinks by the grill. Alex, naturally, claimed the best spot again, the chair that wobbled precariously but somehow symbolized his kingdom. He leaned back, arms crossed, chest out, and made a small, dismissive noise when I reached for a chair nearby. "Make sure it's stable," he said, barely glancing at me, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't want you falling over." Everyone laughed. I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to respond, to let him know that I wasn't fragile, that I wasn't invisible, but I held my tongue. I had spent too long letting moments like this slip by, but there was a new clarity in my mind. Instead of reacting with anger or embarrassment, I could let the situation unfold and think strategically. I observed him, the way he shifted his weight, the way he leaned on his friends for validation, the subtle arrogance in his tone. Every move he made was predictable, and yet, in his mind, he was untouchable. That arrogance, I realized, was my leverage. As the afternoon stretched on, the air thick with the smell of grilling meat and the low buzz of conversation, I started noticing the little things that had always gone unremarked. The way Mom kept stealing glances at him, like she was proud of this version of her son that seemed to shine effortlessly in public. The way Dad nodded approvingly at every word Alex spoke, ignoring the fact that I'd been the one quietly fixing his collapsed folding chairs earlier in the morning. Cousins whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at me with that mix of sympathy and amusement, the kind that only reinforced the divide between Alex and me. Each observation stoked the fire inside me, transforming old resentment into a sharper, more deliberate focus. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the backyard, I had made a decision. I wouldn't play the background role any longer. I wouldn't let Alex dictate my place at the table, in the family, or in life. But I also knew that whatever I did, it had to be precise, calculated. Impulsiveness had never worked in my favor. I had to wait, watch, and choose the perfect moment to tilt the scales in my favor. For now, I simply smiled, lifted my glass, and let Alex prattle on, acting like the world revolved around him. But inside, I was already planning, and I could feel that quiet, steady thrill that comes when you realize you're finally ready to stop being the passive observer of your own life. As twilight settled over the yard, the mood remained deceptively calm. Laughter echoed faintly from the group gathered around Alex, and I sat in my chair, feeling the summer heat mixed with anticipation. The first subtle cracks in the facade had begun to appear. Alex was overconfident, everyone else was distracted by his antics, and I had the patience to wait. For the first time in years, I wasn't just enduring, I was plotting. And little did anyone know, the balance of power in this family, long assumed to favor Alex, was about to shift, but the shift wouldn't be chaotic or reckless. It would be precise, and it would be satisfying. Then came the moment that really set everything in motion, though no one yet realized its significance. The waiter from the catering service, a quiet young man with a clipboard, approached the table with the final bill. I didn't notice at first, too absorbed in the simmering tension around Alex, but the waiter's eyes flicked in my direction, and something unspoken passed between us. A recognition, a silent acknowledgement that I was not to be underestimated. When the total was announced, I felt my pulse quicken, because it wasn't just a number, it was a key. A figure that would, in time, become the first domino in a sequence of events that would change everything. The sum was staggering, absurd even. $3,700. Alex looked up, confused, a small frown breaking through his confident mask. The table murmured, unsure what to make of it, and I just sat back, letting the moment stretch. Finally, I smirked, a slow, deliberate expression that carried far more meaning than words. "Not my seat," I said softly, almost to myself, but loud enough for the waiter and Alex to hear. And in that instant, the air shifted. Laughter died down, glances sharpened, and I realized that the first step in reclaiming my place in the family, and maybe teaching Alex a lesson he'd never forget, had begun. After I delivered that simple line, "Not my seat," there was a peculiar silence that stretched across the backyard. Alex froze mid-laugh, his friends stopped their whispering, and even the kids chasing each other around the yard paused for a moment, sensing that something important had just happened. The waiter, young and polite, shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the tension he had stumbled into. I didn't rush to explain, didn't offer any clarification. I just leaned back in my chair, letting the smirk linger on my face long enough for it to unsettle Alex. It was subtle, but I could see the small flicker of irritation cross his features. That flicker would grow, I knew, into something that could be manipulated. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of small provocations and quiet observation. Alex, clearly stung, tried to reclaim the spotlight, but his movements were slightly off. The jokes he made landed flat. The stories he told were punctuated by awkward pauses. Every once in a while, I caught him glancing at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and barely contained frustration. It was almost laughable, the way he seemed unsure how to respond to someone who refused to shrink in his shadow. And yet, even as I enjoyed this subtle power shift, I was aware of my own simmering anger. For years, I had endured his arrogance, the preferential treatment from our parents, the small humiliations that piled up into a mountain of resentment. I'd been patient, but patience only took me so far. Dinner came and went with the usual clamor. More burgers, more potato salad, more laughs at Alex's expense. But the subtle cracks in our family dynamic continued to widen. Mom hovered over him as he claimed the chair closest to the grill, laughing at every word he said, while Dad clapped him on the shoulder in silent agreement. I noticed the way they glanced at me only when necessary, their attention drawn like gravity toward Alex. It wasn't a surprise, really, but it stung sharper than it ever had before. I tried to remind myself that their favoritism wasn't malicious, at least not consciously. They simply never noticed my side, the quieter, less flamboyant Michael who had spent years keeping things smooth while Alex shined. But the sting of invisibility was more acute than usual, maybe because now I was no longer willing to accept it. As the sun dipped lower, the backyard seemed to shrink. The laughter became louder, a bit more forced, as the party moved toward games and casual competitions. Alex suggested a simple cornhole match, naturally assigning himself the role of team captain. "Come on, guys, let's make this fair," he said with that self-important grin of his, "but I call first pick. Can't have anyone falling behind." I wanted to ignore him, but a strange mixture of irritation and resolve forced me to respond. "I'll play," I said calmly, keeping my tone neutral. "Somebody has to beat you eventually." A ripple of laughter followed, but not directed at me, at least not overtly. Alex's friends exchanged glances, and I noticed the subtle shift. He hesitated, maybe for the first time all day, before assigning me a team. His smirk faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly with a forced laugh. "Sure, why not? Just don't get in the way, all right?" That's all it took. I let the words roll over me, recording every syllable, every condescending tone. I could feel the familiar tightness in my chest, the anger that had been simmering for years, but now it was no longer blind fury. It was precise, deliberate, controlled. The match itself was deceptively simple, but I played with a focus that surprised even me. Every throw, every glance, every movement was deliberate. I wasn't just playing cornhole. I was observing, cataloging Alex's reactions, noting how quickly he became flustered when things didn't go perfectly according to his plan. His friends started to murmur, noticing the uncharacteristic strain on his face, and that small ripple of uncertainty only fueled my own determination. By the third round, it was clear that I wasn't just holding my own. I was winning, and Alex was visibly unnerved. His laugh, once confident, now had an edge of desperation. That evening, as the shadows grew longer and the air cooled, the subtle tension reached a peak. Mom suggested we move to the deck for dessert, and Alex immediately claimed the chair at the head of the table. Without thinking, I followed, selecting a seat that put me directly across from him. It was a small, almost invisible act, but I noticed the flicker of recognition in his eyes, an acknowledgement that I was no longer the passive participant he assumed me to be. Dessert was served, a mix of pies and custards that Mom insisted were her finest creations, and conversation resumed, but it was strained. Alex was still trying to regain control, but his usual charm felt forced, his usual confidence slightly frayed. And then it happened, the moment that would change everything. One of Alex's friends, a girl named Clara, leaned in during a lull in conversation and whispered something that I only caught because my curiosity made me eavesdrop. At first, I didn't process it fully, just filed it away as a casual remark. But as the words sank in, my stomach dropped. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking about me, quietly, just loud enough for me to hear if I listened closely. "He thinks you're still going to sit quietly forever, huh? He doesn't even realize you've been planning something." My pulse quickened. Planning something? What did she mean? I scanned the table, but Alex was busy talking over someone else, oblivious to the whispered exchange. Clara, noticing my glance, smiled faintly, a secretive expression that suggested she had just handed me a key piece of information without me asking for it. And that's when it hit me, the betrayal that would shatter my patience completely. My parents, my cousins, everyone sitting around the table had always dismissed me, ignored me, or laughed at Alex's antics. But I hadn't realized the depth of their complicity until this exact moment. They weren't just failing to notice. They were actively invested in keeping me in my place. I felt a surge of disbelief, anger, and clarity all at once. Years of quiet indignities, moments of being sidelined, being the background Michael, had been reinforced not just by Alex, but by the people who were supposed to care about me the most. I stared at my parents, noting the subtle smiles, the nods, the way they laughed just a second too long at Alex's jokes. It was all part of a pattern, one I had always sensed but had never truly acknowledged in its full, ugly scope. The realization hit harder than any insult or slight from Alex alone. My own family had been complicit in my erasure. And just when I thought the evening couldn't get more absurdly frustrating, Alex leaned over with a faux friendly smile, pointing at my chair. "Nice spot you picked, Michael. But don't get too comfortable. You know, this isn't really your table." Laughter followed, predictably, but this time it felt heavier, almost cruel. That's when something inside me broke. I had tolerated so many subtle humiliations, so many years of favoritism, and yet here was my brother, still assuming he had the right to dictate my place in my own family's gathering. The betrayal of my parents' silent complicity made the insult sting sharper than usual. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, letting the moment stretch. I could feel all the pent-up frustration, every moment I had been ignored, every opportunity one had been denied, coalescing into a single, precise clarity. This wasn't just about a chair or a cornhole match or a family barbecue. This was about respect, about finally making my presence impossible to ignore. And if Alex, or anyone else, thought I was going to let him continue with his antics unchecked, they were about to learn otherwise. The first act of planning began in that moment, quiet, internal, almost invisible. I would not react impulsively, not yet. I would wait, observe, and calculate. Every misstep Alex made, every overconfidence-driven assumption, every small betrayal would be cataloged, remembered, and leveraged. I realized that the only way to truly claim my place, and maybe, finally, force my family to see me as more than a background character, was to turn the situation on its head. But even as I sat there, calm on the surface, my mind racing beneath, the air suddenly shifted again. I didn't notice it at first. The subtle way Alex's friends began whispering, the glance from Clara that suggested she had just set something in motion, but then the real betrayal became undeniable. My parents, who had smiled indulgently at Alex's jokes all afternoon, now laughed at something I had said, a simple, harmless remark I had made in passing. Their laughter wasn't warm or affectionate. It was dismissive, condescending, mocking. It was the first time I had been openly laughed at in front of the entire family in years, and it cut sharper than any slight Alex had ever delivered. I froze. My hand tightened around my glass, my knuckles whitening. The betrayal wasn't just Alex's anymore. It was my parents' too. The realization hit me like a punch. Not only had they failed to protect me from years of condescension and favoritism, they were now actively participating in it. The hot anger that had simmered quietly for years boiled over, but I didn't let it show. I just smiled, a slow, controlled smile, and thought, this changes everything. Everything I thought I knew about family, about loyalty, about respect, was about to be put to the test. And I would make sure that the next move, the first real move, would be mine. The night ended with small talk, a few goodbyes, and Alex's smug grin as he strutted off to his car with his friends. But inside, the tension had reached a breaking point. The quiet simmer of resentment, the slow, methodical awareness of betrayal, and the sharp sting of recognition that my parents were complicit had created a perfect storm. I knew, deep down, that whatever happened next, the dynamics of our family had irrevocably shifted. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, a plan began to take shape. A careful, deliberate strategy that would ensure that years of disrespect, favoritism, and betrayal would not go unanswered. But I wasn't ready to act yet. The fire was lit, the pieces were in place, and the tension had become unbearable. I could feel the first real step toward reclaiming my dignity and power forming, but it would have to wait. Timing, as I had learned over the years, was everything. The breaking point had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. The days after that family barbecue were hard. More than hard, they were disorienting, a strange combination of humiliation, anger, and a sense that I had finally seen my family for what they were. The laughter at my expense, Alex's smug triumph, and my parents' complicity clung to me like an invisible weight. I tried to carry on with normal life, but everything felt heavier, the world somehow sharper and less forgiving. I couldn't stop replaying their faces, the way they had dismissed me in front of everyone, the way Alex had practically strutted away with the smug confidence of someone who had just won a war I didn't even realize I was fighting. I went to work that Monday feeling hollow. I manage a small department in a local marketing firm, and normally I take pride in my efficiency and problem solving. But that week, I couldn't focus. Every email I sent felt hollow, every meeting a performance I couldn't fully inhabit. I kept thinking about the chair, about the laughter, about the absurd $3,700 bill I had smirked at, but that had felt symbolic of so much more. The cost of my invisibility in my own family. The incident didn't just sting, it shook me to my core. For the first time in years, I realized how much of myself I had silently given away to avoid conflict, to maintain peace, to keep the illusion that my family loved me equally. And now I couldn't unsee it. The first few nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying snippets of that day. Alex leaning back in that wobbly chair, his friends whispering, my parents laughing. The betrayal cut deeper each time I revisited it. I felt small, insignificant, invisible, the exact role I had spent decades trying to shrug off. There was a part of me that wanted to lash out, to confront Alex, to scream at mom and dad for their complicity. But experience had taught me that impulsiveness only led to regret, and this time, I wanted something different. I wanted power, control, and the satisfaction of not just being acknowledged, but being feared, respected, even envied. So I began quietly. Step 1 was self-assessment. I needed to understand exactly what had gone wrong in my life that allowed this dynamic to persist. I realized that over the years, I had allowed my own self-worth to be dictated by others. I had sought approval from my parents, validation from my brother, and yet I had rarely stood up for myself. I had accepted their hierarchy silently, hoping that eventually, my patience or reliability would earn recognition. But now, after seeing their true colors, I understood that recognition would never come from them. It had to come from me. The next step was subtle rebuilding. I started small. I reorganized my apartment, creating a space that felt entirely mine, a sanctuary where I could think clearly and plan. I spent evenings reading books on negotiation, psychology, and strategy, studying not just business tactics, but the subtle art of influence and power. I joined a few professional networking groups, ones I had always considered out of reach because I thought I wasn't charismatic or bold enough. Slowly, cautiously, I began putting myself into spaces where I could grow, away from my family's shadow. At work, I took on projects that others avoided, ones with high visibility and high stakes. I didn't shout about my contributions, but I made sure that results were undeniable. I documented everything meticulously, keeping records of successes, numbers, and feedback. Every presentation, every meeting, every proposal was executed with precision. The thrill of competence, of finally seeing tangible proof of my capabilities, began to replace the gnawing resentment I had carried since the barbecue. I realized I didn't need my family's approval to validate me. I needed only my own standards, and perhaps, one day, the satisfaction of letting them realize just how much they had underestimated me. Socially, I started being selective. Alex's friends had always hovered around him, feeding into his ego and reinforcing my invisibility. I began connecting with people who appreciated intelligence, reliability, and subtlety. I found allies who didn't just laugh at his jokes or cheer his victories. They saw the work I did behind the scenes, the thoughtfulness I brought, the quiet strength that had always been ignored. Slowly, my confidence grew. It wasn't loud or brash. It was steady, an internal flame that refused to be extinguished. The hardest part, though, was dealing with the emotional fallout. There were nights when I wanted to pick up the phone and call mom or dad, to demand recognition or apology. I wanted to confront Alex directly, to make him feel the discomfort he had caused me for so many years. But I didn't. I realized that confrontation without preparation would only play into his hands. I needed leverage. I needed patience. I needed a plan that would allow me to rise above, not just react. That realization, though frustrating, became empowering. I understood that my ascent couldn't be impulsive. It had to be strategic, precise, and undeniable. In the midst of rebuilding, an unexpected ally emerged. Clara, the friend who had whispered that subtle warning at the barbecue. I hadn't spoken to her directly yet, but we connected online, exchanged messages about work, life, and ambitions. Her perspective was invaluable. She didn't just see me as Alex's overshadowed older brother. She saw potential, capability, and cunning. From her, I learned to view the situation differently, not just as a personal slight, but as a puzzle, one where patience and careful moves could yield maximum effect. She didn't offer solutions. She offered insight, subtle nudges that sharpened my perspective. Financially, I began to take small, deliberate steps to secure my independence. I had been frugal before, but now every choice had purpose. I reviewed investments, adjusted savings, and began exploring opportunities one had previously ignored, from side projects to small entrepreneurial ventures. Each success, no matter how minor, reinforced the growing sense of control I had over my own life. I was no longer waiting for validation from my family. I was building a life that could eventually make their recognition irrelevant. Meanwhile, my observation of Alex continued, though from a distance. I noticed how overconfident he remained, how little he seemed to consider the consequences of his arrogance. I watched social media, noting his small triumphs, his missteps, the subtle cracks in his polished persona. Every instance of carelessness, every moment of prideful overreach, became a piece of information, a building block for the strategy one was slowly constructing. My emotions, once reactive and volatile, had become tools. Anger was now energy. Frustration became focus. The humiliation of the barbecue, of years of favoritism and condescension, was being transformed into something powerful, preparation. As weeks turned into months, I began to feel a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The hard work was paying off, not just in results, but in a growing internal sense of dignity and self-worth. I no longer felt the need to prove myself to anyone who had ignored me. Instead, I was building a foundation from which my eventual moves would be undeniable. My patience was no longer passive. It was deliberate, a quiet force that promised eventual vindication. But the real turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, I received an invitation to an industry conference, a high-profile event that Alex, and, more importantly, my parents would never consider attending. It was a subtle chance to network, to make connections, to establish myself in spaces they assumed I had no access to. I knew then that the slow climb I had undertaken was reaching a critical stage. The opportunities one had been quietly creating, the competence I had been demonstrating, and the strategic patience I had cultivated were converging. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was positioning myself to rise above the family dynamics that had held me captive for decades. And yet, even as I celebrated these quiet victories, I remained acutely aware of the ticking clock. Alex's arrogance, my parents' favoritism, the subtle betrayals, they had created a combustible environment. One misstep, one careless moment, could undo the careful work I had done. I had to remain vigilant, patient, and precise. My rise would not be public or flamboyant. It would be methodical, deliberate, and undeniable. The rock bottom of that barbecue had been painful, humiliating, and almost unbearable. But from it, I had begun to rebuild, not with the chaos of emotion, but with the quiet certainty of strategy, foresight, and deliberate action. Every success, every small victory, every calculated step forward became part of a larger plan. Alex, my parents, and even the extended family had underestimated me for too long. They didn't know that the Michael they had always ignored was already plotting, already preparing, and already building the foundation for a reckoning they would never see coming. And in that quiet, unassuming way, I realized that the true power didn't come from shouting, from arguing, or from immediate retaliation. It came from patience, planning, and the kind of silent confidence that makes others underestimate you at their own peril. The fire had been lit, the pieces were moving, and the rise from the ashes had begun. The only question left was how high I could climb, and how completely I could ensure that those who had wronged me would finally recognize the price of their dismissiveness. By the time the next summer rolled around, I had become almost unrecognizable, not in appearance, but in presence. Inside, I had shifted from someone who endured to someone who observed, analyzed, and planned with a precision that made my previous life seem like a distant memory. My confidence no longer wavered. My sense of self-worth had hardened into a quiet armor, and the humiliation of that barbecue, along with years of condescension from Alex and my parents, had become fuel for a larger purpose. I wasn't looking for petty revenge anymore. I was constructing something deliberate, intelligent, and unavoidable. The first step in executing any plan is, after all, observation, and I had spent months watching, cataloging, and quietly noting every flaw, arrogance, and overconfidence that Alex and my family displayed. It started with small things, conversations I overheard during family gatherings, subtle slips in judgment Alex made when he assumed everyone around him was docile, the way my parents continued to reward his shallow displays of charm while dismissing my efforts and accomplishments. I didn't respond or challenge, at least, not yet. That would come. For now, I compiled everything mentally, like a blueprint of vulnerabilities. Every misplaced boast, every moment of arrogance, every laugh at my expense was filed away as ammunition. By the time my plan was ready, these would be the points where I would strike with precision. I also began to quietly gather allies. Some were obvious, some less so. Clara remained a key informant, not just a friend, but someone who understood Alex's social patterns, his overconfidence, and the way his friends and our extended family reinforced his sense of entitlement. She offered insight, subtle nudges that confirmed my observations, but she never interfered directly. She gave me context and perspective, how Alex's network operated, how my family unconsciously enabled him, and how even minor disruptions could ripple into chaos if introduced strategically. I realized that leverage wasn't just about exposing flaws. It was about carefully orchestrating circumstances where those flaws would lead to public consequences. Professionally, I continued to consolidate my position. At work, my projects began gaining recognition beyond my immediate department. I attended high-profile conferences, networked with influential people in my industry, and quietly built a reputation for reliability, insight, and strategic thinking. Every success became a quiet signal, not just to me, but to the world that I was competent, capable, and untouchable. Most importantly, I knew that when the time came, these successes could be used in the context of family dynamics, not braggadocio, but undeniable evidence of a life I had built despite their dismissiveness. Alex and my parents assumed I existed on their periphery. That assumption was about to be dismantled. Financially, I positioned myself carefully. I had saved strategically over the past year, cutting unnecessary expenses and redirecting resources into opportunities that could amplify my influence. Investments, side projects, and even small entrepreneurial ventures allowed me to gain independence, creating leverage in ways Alex would never expect. While he flaunted superficial victories, boats, gadgets, summer trips, my strategy was deeper, long-term, and sustainable. I wasn't chasing immediate validation. I was building a structure that would, when fully realized, force recognition and perhaps even admiration, whether they were willing to offer it or not. But the most critical aspect of my preparation was psychological. I needed to refine patience into an art form. Every interaction with Alex and my family became an exercise in observation, restraint, and subtle manipulation. I studied their responses, learned their triggers, and began to experiment with small nudges, comments, gestures, suggestions that would later amplify the chaos I intended to unleash. The key was subtlety. A misstep, an overreaction, or premature exposure of my plan could destroy months of preparation. Every move had to be measured, deliberate, and nearly invisible until the final reveal. Family gatherings became the perfect stage. I began attending more, but differently. No longer timid or eager for approval, I maintained a quiet confidence. I arrived early, prepared to watch and listen. I observed Alex's patterns, how he claimed authority over seating arrangements, how he monopolized conversations, how he relied on the implicit agreement that no one would challenge him. I noticed the small ways he assumed compliance, the micro-expressions of entitlement that betrayed his overconfidence. These observations were cataloged, mentally recorded for later use. I also began planting seeds of disruption. Small comments, almost casual, designed to be remembered and interpreted later in my favor. For example, I might compliment one of Alex's minor achievements in a way that subtly implied that I had the capacity to achieve far more if I chose to. Or I would ask a pointed, polite question during conversation that forced him to justify a boast he assumed no one would scrutinize. Each interaction was calculated, a test of his arrogance, a probe for weaknesses, a subtle undermining of the untouchable persona he relied upon. Over time, these microacts began creating cracks in his confidence. He didn't notice, or if he did, he dismissed them with a laugh that I knew was slightly forced. But the cracks were there, and when the time came, they would widen under pressure. One evening, after another family dinner where Alex had once again commandeered the head of the table, I noticed the perfect opportunity, a small, seemingly inconsequential slip that would later have outsized consequences. He bragged about a friend's successful business venture, embellishing the story in a way that revealed a basic misunderstanding of financial risk. Everyone laughed politely, assuming his authority was unimpeachable, but I recognized the flaw immediately. It was minor in isolation, but in context, it was a lever I could use. I made a mental note, filing it away as future ammunition. Clara, sensing my focus, sent me a private message later that night. "You're calm, but you're not just calm, you're calculating. Keep noticing, keep collecting. He's going to give you what you need, just don't touch it yet." Her words resonated. I had spent so long reacting, waiting for the right moment, that I now understood the power of anticipation. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about timing, leverage, and inevitability. I needed Alex to continue his arrogance, my parents to continue their favoritism, and my family to remain oblivious. Only then would the structure I had built come crashing down with maximum impact. Over the next several months, I maintained this rhythm: observe, plant, reinforce, grow. I cultivated allies outside the family, refined my professional standing, and continued developing a quiet reputation for competence and insight. Each small success bolstered my confidence, and each minor disruption in Alex's assumed dominance reinforced my strategic approach. I was no longer the overlooked sibling. I was the architect of an eventual reckoning, quietly gathering the tools I would need to execute it flawlessly. The brilliance of my approach was its invisibility. To the untrained eye, I was simply living my life, attending work events, networking, occasionally visiting family, and engaging socially in ways that appeared normal. But every conversation, every glance, every seemingly casual action was calculated. I cataloged behavior, noted weaknesses, and identified the points where overconfidence, favoritism, and entitlement intersected, exactly the points I would later exploit. Then, finally, the moment came when preparation converged with opportunity. Alex, still unaware of the slow but steady undermining of his confidence, had invited the entire extended family to another gathering, promising an elaborate summer barbecue of his own. He had, predictably, assumed the role of center stage, boasting about the menu, the music, and the seating arrangements. My parents, predictably, deferred to him, offering praise and validation while barely acknowledging my presence. But this time, I wasn't just present, I was ready. I arrived early, casually, observing every detail: the placement of chairs, the flow of food, the subtle social dynamics that Alex assumed were immutable. Everything was visible, every flaw cataloged, every opportunity noted. I was calm, controlled, patient, confident. Every member of the family was falling neatly into the patterns I had predicted, and I could feel the tension building. Not mine, but the tension I would soon introduce. And then, as Alex flaunted his dominance over the setup, his friends reinforcing his authority, I realized something critical. All the small actions I had taken over the past year, quietly building my reputation, observing patterns, planting seeds, creating leverage, were converging into a moment that could not be ignored. The balance of power, long assumed to favor him, was about to shift, and nothing he had done would prepare him for what was coming. My patience, my strategy, and my quiet rise from humiliation had placed me in a position where a single, well-timed move could topple the carefully constructed hierarchy of arrogance and favoritism that had dominated my family for years. Everything was ready. The pieces were in place. The setup was complete. And all that remained was the perfect moment to act, a moment that would change everything, not with chaos or impulsiveness, but with calculated inevitability. The question wasn't if I would execute it. It was when. The day had arrived. Alex's grand summer barbecue, his self-proclaimed event of the year, was set to be the stage for my long-awaited move. I arrived early, as I always did now, carrying nothing but my calm, unshakable confidence. My parents were there before me, bustling around in their usual fawning mode, congratulating Alex on everything from the perfectly arranged chairs to the playlist he had curated. I smiled politely, feeling no need for approval. I wasn't here to be acknowledged. I was here to execute. Every year of being overlooked, every condescending laugh, every subtle slight, they all converged into this precise moment. The backyard was immaculate, the tables perfectly aligned, the grill sizzling with the first batches of food. Alex was already performing, commanding attention, cracking jokes, and giving overly dramatic explanations about how he had planned this all himself. His friends hung on every word, laughing at every punchline. I watched him for a long moment, cataloging his arrogance, savoring the inevitability of the shift I had orchestrated. It was subtle, but the tension underneath his smile was already visible to me. I began by planting small seeds, seemingly casual comments that would trigger the unraveling. A few gentle remarks about safety with the grill. It's impressive how you're managing all this, but did you check the propane line? I remember a minor leak last year. A quiet question about seating arrangements that implied my awareness of the potential chaos if things were moved haphazardly. No one else noticed the hints, but Alex did, and his slight tightening of the jaw and forced grin were exactly what I had been waiting for. Next came my professional leverage. Months ago, I had cultivated contacts with several high-profile suppliers, event coordinators, and catering services without Alex or my parents noticing. I had quietly arranged for a small inspection of the grill setup under the guise of providing safety guidance from an industry perspective. When they arrived, I introduced them casually, noting, I thought it might be helpful to have professionals look things over before the crowd arrives. My parents, naturally, deferred to me, perhaps the first time in decades that they actually followed my lead. Alex, of course, bristled. He smiled, nodded, and laughed, but I could see the subtle panic behind the performance. As the inspection progressed, small problems began to surface. Minor but undeniable errors in Alex's setup, oversights he had assumed would go unnoticed, were now pointed out by professionals he couldn't argue with. A wobbly table, an unbalanced grill, improper propane connections, all minor, individually, but collectively undeniable. Alex's voice, which had been so commanding and confident just minutes before, began to strain under subtle critique. His friends exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or worry, and my parents' eyes shifted between Alex and me in a way I had never seen before. Respect, recognition, and a flicker of guilt. The next phase was psychological. I had coordinated a small social reveal that would capitalize on Alex's growing unease. I had spent months connecting with our extended family members outside these gatherings, subtly sharing stories of my professional accomplishments, my strategic successes, and even minor victories in ways that seemed casual but carried weight. Now, at the barbecue, I allowed those stories to surface naturally. Conversations with cousins, a few well-timed compliments about my career, and quiet acknowledgments of my achievements began to ripple through the gathering. Every mention, every nod, every quiet recognition chipped away at the pedestal on which Alex had been placed for decades. By mid-afternoon, the subtle pressure was building, and I knew it was time for the final piece. I had arranged for a small, friendly challenge among cousins and friends, a cornhole tournament, seemingly innocuous but carefully designed to expose Alex's overconfidence. I volunteered last, claiming to join for fun, and immediately noticed the shift in dynamics. Alex, naturally, claimed the position of team captain, assigning players and orchestrating the game with over-the-top theatrics. But this time, The careful observations, the years of cataloged arrogance, became my advantage. I deliberately chose my team, including a few allies who had become quietly aware of my strategy, and positioned them to maximize subtle psychological pressure. The match began, and everything unfolded exactly as I had envisioned. Alex's initial throws were slightly off, not catastrophic, but noticeable to anyone paying attention. His friends, who had previously bolstered him unquestioningly, began exchanging subtle expressions of doubt. I, on the other hand, remained calm, precise, and focused. Every throw was deliberate, every point calculated. When I finally made a difficult shot, perfectly landing in a tricky position, a ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Alex's composure faltered, his laugh a touch forced, his smile tight. Small whispers started among his friends, and I realized that the tide had turned. The crowning moment came in the final round. Alex, desperate to reclaim his pedestal, attempted a high-risk throw, a move he had practiced for years but had never executed under pressure in front of an audience. I had noted the flaw in his technique months ago. As he launched the beanbag, it sailed just slightly off target, clattering into the edge of the board. The reaction was instantaneous. His friends gasped, his parents tensed, and I felt the satisfaction of inevitability. I executed my final throw with calm precision, securing a narrow but undeniable victory. The applause, tentative at first, grew louder as my team celebrated. Alex's face turned red, not from exertion, but from recognition. He had underestimated me, ignored my potential, and dismissed every effort I had made for years. Now, in front of the family, the friends, and the carefully arranged audience of subtle allies, his pedestal crumbled. My parents, who had always deferred to him, now looked at me with a mixture of surprise and respect. The shift wasn't dramatic, loud, or chaotic. It was quiet, undeniable, and humiliating for Alex. After the game, I allowed a few casual, pointed remarks to land. I never realized how tricky cornhole could be under pressure, I said lightly, letting my tone convey both humor and confidence. It's amazing what practice and focus can achieve. My parents nodded subtly, and even a few of Alex's friends smiled, perhaps realizing for the first time that I was more than the background character they had assumed I would always be. Alex said nothing. His usual witty comebacks, his attempts to assert control, were gone. He was deflated, exposed, and undeniably human in a way he had never allowed himself to be in public. Dinner that evening continued, but the dynamics had shifted irreversibly. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer the overlooked sibling. My parents' subtle deference, the way they engaged with me, and the quiet recognition from extended family and friends reinforced the new balance. Alex attempted to recover, but the cracks in his persona, now exposed to a carefully cultivated audience, were impossible to repair. I had orchestrated the perfect combination of psychological leverage, social dynamics, and professional credibility to ensure that he, and by extension, my family, could not dismiss me again. By the end of the night, I had achieved something far greater than victory in a game or a moment of social triumph. I had claimed my place, not through chaos, argument, or dramatics, but through patience, strategy, and the quiet, deliberate accumulation of power and recognition. The satisfaction wasn't loud or brash. It was steady, deep, and irreversibly earned. I watched Alex walk away, his friends trailing behind, and my parents glanced at me with expressions that were equal parts surprise and acknowledgement. I didn't need to say a word. Everything had been communicated through action, through the careful orchestration of circumstance, and through the undeniable display of competence, calm, and strategy. As I leaned back in my chair that night, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the backyard, I felt an immense sense of closure. The humiliation, favoritism, and years of quiet erasure were finally met with consequence. Not chaotic, impulsive revenge, but a measured, intelligent, and undeniably effective reclamation of my dignity. I had risen from the background to a position of recognition and power, and there was no turning back. Alex, my parents, and the extended family could no longer ignore me, and the lessons of my past would resonate every time they interacted with me in the future. I took a slow sip of my drink, feeling the cool evening air on my skin, and allowed myself a small, private smile. For decades, they had underestimated me. For decades, they had assumed I would remain quiet, compliant, invisible. But I had changed the rules of the game, and now the only seat that mattered was mine. Quiet, deliberate, undeniable. Not because I demanded it, not because I shouted for it, but because I had earned it, meticulously, strategically, and with a patience that no one, not even my entitled, arrogant brother, could have anticipated. And in that moment, as the final laughter faded and the last scraps of food were cleared, I realized something profound. Sometimes the sweetest victory isn't in shouting, arguing, or forcing recognition. Sometimes it's in quietly building a life so undeniable, so competent, so unmistakably your own, that the world, and the people who once tried to diminish you, can no longer pretend you don't exist. I leaned back in the chair, perfectly stable this time, and thought to myself, this spot has always been mine.